In pre-Islamic Arabia, hospitality was of such importance that a guest at the home of an Arab was guaranteed at least 3 days of total security and protection before he would even be questioned about why he was there. This tradition was further enforced by the Prophet, who stated that a guest has the right to be hosted for 3 days. The desert was not a place to be alone, with so many threats to the survival of the Arabs community. Cooperation was essential. Reliance on relatives was the first line of defense against famine and the heat that constantly threatened survival. Families were expected to share resources and shelter, and the concept of pure individualism was strongly frowned upon. As such, the family and by extension the tribe served as the most important unit within Arab society. Groups of families traveled together and were considered a kabila or clan. Several clans would constitute a tribe led by led by a tribal leader led by a tribal leader called Sheikh. Tribal identity and belonging were vital in the pre-Islamic world. Belonging to a tribe brought protection, support, and economic opportunities. Tribes would go to battle to defend one of their own, and tribal warfare was unnervingly common before the arrival of Islam. Competition over grazing lands and flocks regularly brought tribes into devastating competition over grazing lands and flocks regularly brought tribes into devastating wars which could last years and extract a heavy human toll on the participants. For the Arabs, struggle was a constant against both man and nature. In a tribal, nomadic society like this, artistic expression becomes difficult. The resources and time necessary to complete great sculptures and paintings like the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Greece were almost non existent. Yet the natural human desire to search for beauty could not be extinguished by the desert sands. Instead, it took on a new form, language. Perhaps more than any other language in the world, Arabic itself is a form of artistic expression. Word and sentence structure fluent, is fluid, is fluid, creating many different ways for a person to express the same idea. Poetry thus naturally became the de facto art of Arabia. Long epic poems glorifying tribes and heroism in war were their greatest works of art. The finest poets were revered celebrities in every way. Their words were memorized by the masses and repeated for generations. Seven most magnificent magnificent and pre-Islamic poems were known as the Muallaqat, meaning the hanging ones. They were so called because they were hung on the walls of the Kaaba in Mecca, or alternatively because they were hung in the hearts of all Arabs due to their reverence for the poetic medium. Despite being an advanced literary society, writing was rare in the Arabian Peninsula, while a written form of the language did exist by the 1500s. It was rarely learned. Memorization was enough for the Arabs, who were capable of learning poems that were thousands of lines long by heart, so they could repeat them to future generations. Memorization would prove to be a vital skill once Islam arrived in the peninsula in the 1600s. When it came to religion, the pre Islamic Arabs were almost exclusively polytheistic. Islamic tradition holds that the Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail built the Kaaba in the valley of Mecca in ancient times as a house of worship for one god. The Kaaba was built as a plain rectangular building on a foundation set by the first man Adam alayhi salam. From this shrine, Ismail was able to preach the monotheistic message to the Arabs, who adopted him as one of their own. Over the centuries, however, the progeny of Ismail distorted his monotheistic teachings. Stone and wood idols were carved to represent attributes of God. Later they, later they would go on to represent separate gods entirely. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there were 360 gods in the Kaaba. The message of Ibrahim and Ismail was not entirely lost on the Arabs. However, the two prophets were still revered figures in the minds of the Arabs, and even some of their basic teachings still held weight in this society. They certainly believed in the God of Ibrahim and Ismail, called Allah in Arabic, but they believed he was one among many different gods represented by the idols. This belief system was far removed from the strict monotheism those two prophets had preached. And reflected influence from Sumerian religions to the north. Isolated Christian and Jewish communities existed within the Arabian Peninsula and also revered the prophets. But that was where their similarities ended. The sparse monotheists of Arabia tended to avoid complete assimilation with the polytheistic Arabs, instead creating their own insular communities. Arabia's neighbors. In spite of being deep in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, far from more advanced civilizations, the Arabs were not completely isolated from their neighbors. The Romans had become a regional. The Romans had become a regional superpower along the northern borders of the peninsula in the early decades CE. By putting down numerous Jewish revolts in the province of Syria, Palestina, the Romans stamped their control on the area. For the Bedouin Arabs, this meant the presence of a wealthy and strong trading partner to the north. Merchants merchants regularly traversed the western part of the peninsula from Yemen to in the south to Syria in the north, trading goods that came from places as far away as India and Italy. The Romans were the Romans were content to remain in the more hospitable and familiar lands of the fertile Crescent and let the nomadic Arabs carry on the trade with more distant lands. To the northeast of Arabia lies the Iranian plateau. The rise of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia in the 200 CE ushered in a centuries long struggle between Romans and Persians, which would have its effects on the Arabs. The border between the two great empires fluctuated but was generally in the Syrian desert. In the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, both the Romans and the Persians attempted to gain the upper hand by using Arab tribes, usually ones that had converted to Christianity as proxies. Keen to use this conflict to their own benefit, two Arab tribal confederations developed into client states for the great powers. The, the Ghassanids founded a kingdom in what are now the modern countries of Jordan, Syria, and Palestine, where they served as a buffer for the Roman Empire. Similarly, the Lakhmids controlled southern Mesopotamia, Mesoto- southern Mesopotamia and served the Persians. Both Arab kingdoms were greatly influenced by their overlords, who spent heavily on keeping their vessels well equipped in the face of the enemy. Yet the constant warfare between the two sides would slowly wear down all four parties. By the early 600s, the Romans and Persians were exhausted by decades of warfare and were weakening behind a facade of militaristic power. The Ghassanids and Lakhmids too felt the stress of war, as they were mere pawns in this constant conflict. Most Arab tribes, however, avoided the external conflict between the two imperial powers. They were more interested in carrying on a profitable trade with the two warring empires than helping to decide the winner. To the south of the peninsula was the powerful kingdom of Aksum in Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia. Based high in the Abyssinian mountains, Aksum was a powerful trading state that connected inland African kingdom, the Indian Ocean Sea routes, and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. As a crossroad for trade, it had considerable influence on Arab merchants who dealt with the Aksumites, Aksumites in Yemen. Like Rome, Aksum was a Christian empire that had tension with Persia on numerous occasions. Control of trade routes running through Yemen was a constant source of friction, as both sides sought to turn local leaders into vassals. In the increasingly globalized world of the early 600s, Arabs were aware of their neighbors and became affected by events outside the Arabian Peninsula. Being at a crossroads of three powerful states meant being aware of international politics, and having the skill to use rivalries to their advantage. Yet, despite their precarious location, the Arabs were safe in the depths of the desert. They called their peninsula Jazirat al-Arab, meaning the island of the Arabs, due to how isolated its inhabitants were. This isolated proved to be This isolation proved to be greatly beneficial. The harsh environments meant that none of the surrounding states could invade and occupy Arab lands. The Arabs' traditional cycle of wandering and their way of life was mostly unaffected by regional politics and wars. In this protected environment, a movement would rise in the early 600s that would have huge implications for the surrounding states and eventually the entire world. It would change the destiny of the Arabs forever, building on and using their unique abilities and doing away with the negative cultural traits and kept them as wandering, wearing nomads. Geography, climate, culture, and politics together all lead to the perfect environment in which Islam could rise to become a world power faster than any other movement, religion, or empire in world history. It would sweep out of the deserts of Arabia into the battered Roman and Persian empires. Conquering territories and assimilating diverse peoples, creating an empire that stretched from Spain to India by the early 1700s would have been unfathomable to the Arabs of the early 1600s, who were struggling to survive. Yet all took was the arrival of a man who came with a revolutionary message and a promise to the Arabs of a new destiny, one beyond the sands of Arabia. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The life of the Prophet, second chapter. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born in the town of Mecca around the year 570 CE. He belonged to the Banu Hashim clan, a subset of the Quraysh tribe that controlled Mecca, the trading and religious center deep in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, about 80 kilometers inland from the Red Sea. It benefited greatly from the north-south trade routes that connected the Romans in the north and German in the south. Yet Mecca was far detached from both these places. Hundreds of kilometers of desert surrounding the valley town allowed it to develop independent of any foreign control or influence. Mecca was at once both internationally connected and isolated. But when it came to religion, Mecca was a focal point for the entire Arabian Peninsula. It was the location of the Kaaba and the annual pilgrimage that attracted Arabs from all over the peninsula. So, while Mecca was far away enough to elude imperial control by the Byzantines or Persians, it was central enough to have a major impact on In the Arab people, both of these characteristics would play a major role when Islam began to spread. Early life. Muhammad ﷺ early life was marked by hardship and loss. His father Abdullah died before his birth while on a trading mission in the town of Yathrib, north of Mecca. His mother Amina died when he was 6, leaving his respected grandfather Abdul Muttalib to care for him. 2 years later his grandfather also died, and Muhammad ﷺ came to live with his paternal uncle Abu Talib. Sorry. Despite belonging to the wealthy tribe of Quraysh, Muhammad ﷺ did not grow up amid riches. His status as an orphan and his belonging to the clan of Banu Hashim, considered an inferior branch of Quraysh,